I froze at the doorway, my silk robe clinging to damp skin after my shower. My stepson's gaze locked on mine, his voice barely a whisper. "I heard you crying again." My heart raced. This wasn't the boy I raised. It was a man standing before me, his bare chest glistening in the dim light. The space between us felt electric, and I knew I should leave, but I couldn't move. I used to believe I had the perfect life, a loving husband, a beautiful home, and a stepson who adored me. But that illusion shattered 3 months ago when my husband, Daniel, walked out without warning. 12 years of marriage ended in a single morning. The scent of another woman's perfume lingered in the air as he packed his bags and left me with a single sentence. "I've found someone else." That was the day my world crumbled. For the past 3 months, it's been just me and Ryan, my 19-year-old stepson, in this echoing too-large house. I've been his mother in every way but blood since he was 7. We shared the laughter of his childhood and the grief of losing his mother. I always thought I knew him inside and out, but now I see a side of him I never expected. A man who's taken on more responsibility than he should. Ryan has become my anchor. He's always there, bringing me tea in the mornings, checking on me when I don't eat, and holding me during those dark nights when loneliness feels like a crushing weight. Sometimes, I catch him looking at me with a mix of worry and something else I can't quite name. I tell myself it's just his way of showing concern, but deep down, I feel the line between motherly affection and something forbidden starting to blur. He's no longer the boy I raised. His broad shoulders, strong jawline, and quiet confidence remind me more of his father than I care to admit. But while Daniel made me feel small, Ryan's presence fills the room with warmth. He notices the little things, when I change my hair, when I smile for the first time in days, when I silently cry in the dark. My therapist says I'm clinging to the only stability I have left, projecting my loneliness onto someone familiar. She might be right, but how do I explain the way my heart skips a beat when Ryan brushes past me, or the way his touch lingers just a second too long? I don't want to feel this way, but I can't ignore the growing tension. Each moment we spend together feels more intimate, more charged. And I'm terrified of what that means for both of us. The cracks in my life began as whispers, small, unspoken truths that I ignored, hoping they'd fade. But the more I tried to deny them, the louder they grew. Ryan was always there, filling the void Daniel left behind. Yet lately, his presence felt different, heavier, as if something unspoken lingered between us. It started with little things. He began staying up late to make sure I wasn't alone, sitting beside me on the couch as I stared blankly at the television. His hand would rest on my shoulder or brush against mine, lingering just long enough to leave me wondering if it was intentional. At first, I told myself it was nothing, a boy looking out for his stepmother. But the way he looked at me, his dark eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place, made my chest tighten. One evening, I caught him staring at me from across the dinner table. I was still in my work clothes, my blouse slightly undone after a long day. His gaze lingered, and when our eyes met, he didn't look away. Instead, he smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a shiver down my spine. I quickly busied myself with clearing the plates, but my hands trembled as I carried them to the sink. Then there was the night I found him in the living room, his laptop open on the coffee table. He'd fallen asleep on the couch, his face peaceful in the glow of the screen. I leaned in to close it, but a single line on the webpage caught my eye. How to comfort someone after a breakup. My heart ached at his thoughtfulness, but it also left me confused. Was this just concern for me, or was it something more? The tension grew unbearable after a particularly stormy night. The power had gone out, and we huddled together under blankets on the couch. As the rain lashed against the windows, I told him stories about my past, dreams I had before Daniel, the art career I abandoned for marriage, the pieces of myself I lost along the way. Ryan listened intently, his hand gripping mine like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. When his fingers brushed my cheek to wipe away a stray tear, my breath caught. "We shouldn't be like this," I murmured, my voice trembling. "But we are," he replied softly, his gaze locked on mine. "And it doesn't feel wrong." That moment haunted me for days. I began noticing how often he touched me. A hand on my lower back as I passed him in the hallway, a gentle squeeze on my shoulder when I seemed distant. The way his fingers would linger just a second too long when he handed me my coffee. Each touch felt like a question, unspoken but undeniable. And then there was the sketch. I had started drawing again, using my art as an escape from the chaos in my mind. One afternoon, while Ryan was studying at the kitchen table, I found myself sketching his profile. The strong line of his jaw, the curve of his lips, the quiet intensity in his eyes. When I realized what I'd done, I shoved the sketch into a drawer, my face burning with shame. But later that night, he found it. "It's beautiful," he said, holding the drawing up to the light. "Why did you hide it?" I didn't have an answer. I couldn't tell him that capturing him on paper felt too intimate, too raw, like I'd exposed a part of myself I wasn't ready to face. As the days passed, the line between us grew thinner. I told myself it was grief, loneliness, the aftermath of a failed marriage. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something dangerous. And the worst part, I didn't want it to stop. The shift between us wasn't sudden, but rather a slow unraveling of boundaries. It happened in quiet moments, shared glances that lingered too long, touches that sent sparks through my skin, and conversations that felt too intimate for a mother and her stepson. Each day, I told myself to create distance, to be the responsible one, but every time I tried, I found myself drawn closer to him. One evening, after a long day of teaching, I returned home to find Ryan cooking dinner. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the kitchen, and he greeted me with a warm smile, his sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms that seemed stronger than I remembered. "You look tired this morning," he said, handing me a glass of wine. "I thought you'd appreciate a night off." As I sat at the counter, watching him move with ease through the kitchen, I couldn't help but notice how comfortable he looked, how domestic. The sight of him chopping vegetables, his brow furrowed in concentration, stirred something in me I didn't want to name. When he placed the plate in front of me, his hand brushed mine, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the food. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice quieter than I intended. He didn't respond, but the way his gaze lingered on me spoke volumes. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about him, his hands, his smile, the way he looked at me as if I were the only person in the world. I tried to convince myself it was loneliness, a desperate need for connection after Daniel's betrayal. But the truth was far more dangerous. I wasn't just seeking comfort, I was falling for him. The next morning, I found him waiting for me in the kitchen, a cup of coffee in hand. "I thought we could take a drive," he suggested, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "There's this trail I found last week. It's beautiful, you'll love it." I hesitated, knowing I should say no, but the hope in his expression made it impossible to refuse. The drive was quiet at first, the radio filling the silence between us. But as the miles passed, he began to talk about his classes, his plans for the future, and his memories of his mother. His vulnerability was disarming, and I found myself sharing pieces of my own past, things I hadn't told anyone before. When we reached the trail, the late afternoon sun bathed everything in golden light. We walked side by side, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath our feet and the occasional rustle of the wind. At one point he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. I didn't pull away. "You're amazing, you know that?" he said, stopping to face me. His words caught me off guard, and I could feel my cheeks flush under his gaze. "I mean it," he continued. "You've been through so much, but you're still here. Still standing." I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "I don't feel amazing," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "You are to me," he said, his tone soft but firm. Before I could respond, he stepped closer, his hand cupping my cheek. I should have pulled away, should have told him this was wrong, but I couldn't. The warmth of his touch, the intensity in his eyes, it was all too much. When his lips brushed against mine, it felt like the world stopped. The kiss was brief, tentative, but it left me breathless. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, stepping back. "I shouldn't have." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice trembling. "Don't apologize." For a moment we stood there, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy in the air. Then, without a word, he took my hand and led me back to the car. The drive home was silent, but the tension between us was palpable. When we reached the house, he hesitated before getting out. "Emma," he began, his voice uncertain. "I know," I said, cutting him off. "We shouldn't, but I don't know how to stop." The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and suppressed emotions. Each touch, each glance, each accidental brush of our hands felt like a step closer to a line we couldn't uncross. At night, I found myself lying awake, replaying the kiss in my mind, wondering what it meant for us. One evening, as I sketched in my studio, he appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Can I sit with you?" he asked. I nodded, unable to find my voice. He settled into the chair across from me, watching as I worked. When I finally looked up, I found his gaze fixed on me, his eyes dark with emotion. "Emma," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to do this anymore, Pretend that I don't feel this way." The confession hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, I reached out, my hand brushing against his. The electricity between us was undeniable, and in that moment, I knew we'd crossed the point of no return. The storm broke on a quiet Sunday evening. The house was still, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Ryan and I had spent the day circling each other, the weight of our growing connection hanging like a thundercloud. Every glance, every touch felt like it carried the potential to shatter what little normalcy we had left. I was in the kitchen, pretending to focus on the pile of dishes in the sink, when I heard his footsteps behind me. His presence was magnetic. I could feel the warmth of him before he spoke. "Emma," he said softly, his voice closer than I expected. I turned to face him, and the look in his eyes made my breath catch. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only raw, unfiltered emotion. Before I could stop myself, the words slipped out. "We need to talk." His brow furrowed, and he stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine as he reached for the edge of the counter. "About what?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "About us," I said, barely able to meet his gaze. The word hung in the air like a challenge, daring us to confront the reality we'd been avoiding. He exhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I can't pretend anymore, Emma," he admitted. "I can't keep acting like you're just my stepmom when every part of me feels this." "This what?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. This mess? This mistake?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might walk away. But then he took a step closer, his hands gripping the counter on either side of me, trapping me in the space between his body and the cold, unyielding surface. "This feeling," he said, his voice low and intense. "This pull I can't ignore. This need to be close to you, to take care of you, to love you in a way that scares the hell out of me." Tears pricked at my eyes, and I shook my head, trying to push past him, to escape the intensity of his confession. But he didn't let me go. His hands moved to my shoulders, holding me gently but firmly. "Emma, look at me," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. I hesitated but finally raised my eyes to meet his. The vulnerability in his expression broke something inside me. "We can't do this," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's wrong. People would never understand." "I don't care what people think," he replied, his grip tightening slightly. "I care about you. I care about us." The word us sent a shiver down my spine. It was the first time either of us had acknowledged it out loud, and the weight of it was overwhelming. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that we could never be us. But the truth was, a part of me wanted it too. The sound of the front door slamming startled us both, and we jumped apart as if burned. My heart raced as footsteps echoed down the hall. For a brief, terrifying moment, I thought it might be Daniel, back to reclaim the life he'd abandoned. But when the figure appeared in the doorway, it was worse. "Rachel." Her eyes swept over the scene, taking in the tension between us, the way we stood too close, the guilty looks on our faces. Her lips parted in shock, and I could see the realization dawning in her expression. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. I froze, my mind racing for an explanation, an excuse, anything that could make this moment less damning. But Ryan stepped forward, his chin held high, his voice steady. "Rachel, this isn't what it looks like," he began, but she cut him off with a sharp laugh. "Isn't it?" she snapped, her gaze shifting to me. "Emma, tell me this isn't what I think it is." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth was too heavy, too tangled in guilt and desire. Ryan reached for my hand, and I let him, the gesture as much for my comfort as his. Rachel's eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer. "You're serious," she said, her tone shifting from incredulous to horrified. "Oh my God, you're serious." "It's not," I started, but she cut me off again. "Not what? Not a betrayal? Not a complete violation of every boundary that's supposed to exist between a mother and her stepson?" "I'm not a child," Ryan interjected, his voice rising slightly. "I'm an adult. This is my decision, too." "Your decision?" Rachel's laugh was bitter, almost cruel. "You think this is about you? About your feelings? Emma, you're supposed to be the adult here. You're supposed to protect him, not—" "Don't," I said, my voice breaking. "Don't act like you know what this is. You don't understand." "Then help me understand," she challenged, her eyes blazing. "Explain to me how this happened, how you let it get this far." I looked away, shame flooding my chest. There was no explanation that would satisfy her, no way to justify what we'd done. But Ryan refused to back down. "We didn't plan this," he said firmly. We didn't choose this. It just happened. Rachel shook her head, her expression a mixture of sadness and anger. You're playing with fire, she said quietly. You're going to destroy each other. Her words hit like a blow, and for a moment I felt the weight of everything. Our choices, our fears, the inevitable fallout. But then Ryan's hand tightened around mine and I looked at him, saw the determination in his eyes. I won't let that happen, he said, his voice steady. I love her, Rachel. And I'm not walking away. Rachel stared at him, then at me, her expression unreadable. Finally, she let out a long, shaky breath and stepped back. I can't watch this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't be a part of this. She turned and walked out, leaving us standing in the silence, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Ryan turned to me, his expression softening. We'll figure this out, he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. Together. I nodded, but the tears streaming down my face told a different story. Together or not, I knew this was only the beginning of a battle that would test us in ways I wasn't sure we could survive. The house felt heavier after Rachel's departure, her absence leaving a silence that echoed louder than any confrontation. For days, Ryan and I moved through the space like ghosts, avoiding the conversation we both knew was inevitable. The weight of her words lingered, and with it, the realization that the world outside our fragile bubble was beginning to close in. On the third night after Rachel's confrontation, I found Ryan in the living room, his laptop open but untouched. His head rested in his hands, and the sight of him, so vulnerable, so conflicted, made my heart ache. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure if my presence would bring comfort or add to the chaos. But before I could decide, he looked up, his eyes tired but resolute. Are you okay? I asked softly, stepping into the room. He nodded, though his expression told a different story. I've been thinking about what Rachel said, he admitted. About us, about what this could cost. I sank into the seat across from him, my stomach twisting into knots. And, I prompted, my voice barely audible. And I don't care what it costs me, he said firmly. But I can't let it destroy you. His words hit me like a tidal wave, the depth of his love both exhilarating and terrifying. Ryan, this isn't just about me, I said, my voice cracking. This is about both of us. About how we move forward from here. And what does moving forward look like? He asked, his tone tinged with desperation. Pretending this never happened? Walking away and acting like you don't mean everything to me? I don't know, I admitted, tears welling in my eyes. I don't know what the right answer is. All I know is that I can't lose you. His hand found mine, and the warmth of his touch steadied me, even as my world felt like it was crumbling. Then we don't let go, he said simply. We hold on and figure this out together. But figuring it out wasn't as simple as his words made it sound. Rachel's warning had set off a chain reaction in my mind, a storm of doubts and fears that I couldn't quiet. What if she was right? What if this thing between us wasn't love, but loneliness disguised as something more? What if we were setting ourselves up for heartbreak and ruin? The following week brought its own challenges. Rachel, true to her word, had distanced herself entirely. Her texts went unanswered, and her absence at our usual Wednesday support group was glaring. I wanted to reach out to explain, but what could I say? That I was risking everything for something I couldn't even define. At work, the tension was equally suffocating. My colleagues had started to notice my distracted demeanor, the way my thoughts seemed to drift during meetings. Everything okay at home? One of them asked after a particularly long faculty meeting. Fine, I lied, forcing a smile that felt hollow. Just a lot on my plate. The strain seeped into every aspect of my life, but Ryan was my constant, his presence both a balm and a reminder of the precarious line we were walking. He began leaving little notes around the house, on the coffee pot, tucked into my sketchbook, even slipped under my bedroom door. Simple words of encouragement. You're not alone. We'll get through this. But even his optimism couldn't shield us from the inevitable. The whispers started small, harmless, almost imperceptible. A comment from a neighbor about how often Ryan and I were seen together, an offhand remark from a colleague about the cozy dinners we'd shared. Each word felt like a crack in the fragile wall we'd built around ourselves. Then came the dinner invitation. It was from Daniel's parents, a last-minute request for us to join them for a family gathering. Ryan was hesitant, but I insisted. If we don't go, it'll look suspicious, I reasoned. And the last thing we need is more scrutiny. The evening was excruciating. Every interaction felt like walking a tightrope. Every glance between Ryan and me a potential landmine. His grandmother, ever perceptive, watched us with a frown that deepened as the night wore on. When she pulled me aside in the kitchen, my heart nearly stopped. "You've been quiet tonight," she said, her tone casual but her eyes probing. "Is everything all right?" "Just tired," I replied, forcing a smile. "Work's been a lot lately." She nodded, but her gaze lingered. "You know, Emma, you've been such a good influence on Ryan. He's grown into such a fine young man under your care." The compliment felt like a knife to the chest. I managed a weak "thank you" before excusing myself to the bathroom, where I locked the door and let the tears fall. When we returned home that night, Ryan found me sitting at the kitchen table, my head in my hands. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He sat across from me, his expression unreadable. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. "I'm saying maybe Rachel was right. Maybe we need to take a step back before we destroy everything." For a long moment he said nothing. Then finally he reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "If that's what you need, I'll do it," he said quietly. "But know this, I'm not giving up on us. Not now, not ever." His words stayed with me long after he left the room. That night, as I lay awake in the darkness, I realized the truth. There were no easy answers, no perfect resolutions. The only certainty was the depth of my feelings for him, and the knowledge that, no matter what happened, nothing would ever be the same. The days that followed felt like a fragile balancing act. Each decision weighed against the potential fallout. Ryan and I tried to navigate our new reality, but the unspoken tension between us was palpable. Nights were the hardest. Lying awake in my bed, I'd replay every stolen moment, every choice that had led us here. The guilt was suffocating, but so was the thought of losing him. My art became my escape. In the sanctuary of my studio, I poured my emotions onto the canvas, capturing the chaos of my heart in shades of light and shadow. Ryan's profile appeared in my sketches more often than I cared to admit, his image burned into my memory. Yet, the more I tried to distance myself from him, the more I found myself drawn back into his orbit. One evening, after days of avoiding each other, he knocked on my studio door. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice tentative. I hesitated but nodded, unable to deny him even this small request. He stepped inside, his presence filling the room. "I miss you," he said simply, his words carrying the weight of everything we hadn't said. "I miss you too," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But this what we're doing, it's breaking me, Ryan." He crossed the room, his gaze never leaving mine. "It doesn't have to," he said softly. "We can make this work, Emma. We just have to figure out how." "How?" I demanded, my voice rising with frustration. "How do we make this work when every step forward feels like another step toward disaster?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for my hand, his touch steadying me in a way that words couldn't. "By taking it one day at a time," he said finally. "By trusting that what we have is worth the risk." His words lingered in the air, heavy with promise. And as much as I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, a part of me clung to the hope he offered. Because the truth was, I didn't want to let him go. Not yet. Over the next few weeks, we set boundaries, rules to help us navigate the delicate line we were walking. We avoided being alone together for too long, focused on our individual goals, and leaned on our shared love for art and learning to maintain a semblance of normalcy. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. During this time, I threw myself into my work, preparing for a major presentation that could determine my future as a department head. Ryan, ever supportive, reviewed my notes late into the night, his encouragement keeping me grounded even when I felt like I was falling apart. One night, after I'd given my presentation, we sat together on the back porch, the cool autumn air wrapping around us. "You were incredible today," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You're going to get that promotion. I know it." "Thank you," I replied, my heart swelling at his belief in me. "I couldn't have done it without you." He smiled, his expression softening. "You've always been stronger than you think, Emma. You just needed someone to remind you." His words stayed with me long after he went inside, a quiet reminder of the connection we shared. And in that moment, I realized that, despite the challenges we faced, I wasn't alone. We were in this together, for better or worse. As the days turned into weeks, I began to see a path forward. Not one without difficulty or sacrifice, but one that allowed us to move forward with honesty and courage. I started therapy again, this time with a focus on understanding my feelings and setting healthy boundaries. And though it was painful, I reached out to Rachel, apologizing for the hurt I'd caused and hoping to mend the bridge between us. Her response was cautious but hopeful. "I still think you're playing with fire," she wrote. "But I also know you're trying to do what's right." Just promise me you'll be careful. I promised her I would. By the end of the semester, I had accepted a new position at a nearby university, one that would allow me to continue teaching while also giving me the space to focus on my art. Ryan, too, had begun to make plans for his future, applying to graduate programs in environmental science and exploring opportunities outside our small town. The distance, though daunting, felt necessary, a way for both of us to grow independently while still holding on to the connection we'd built. And as we stood on the porch that final night before his departure, I knew we were making the right choice. "I'll miss you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'll miss you too," he replied, pulling me into a hug. "But this isn't goodbye. It's just a new beginning." And as I watched him drive away, his taillights fading into the distance, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in months, I believed that we could weather this storm. Not because it was easy, but because it was worth it. In the end, I learned that love doesn't always follow the rules we set for it. Sometimes it's messy and complicated, forcing us to confront the parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore. But it also has the power to heal, to transform, and to remind us of what it means to truly be alive. What would you do if faced with a love so complicated, so forbidden, that it risked everything you hold dear? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I'm dying to know. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that challenge the boundaries of love and loyalty. Trust me, the next story is one you won't want to miss. Stay tuned, your next obsession starts here.